Hello, 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 Reza. How are you?
I'm good, Chase. Season 2, Episode 1.
Fantastic. This is we've been getting a lot of asks. When is season two starting? Here it is.
Yes, yes, I know. People have been asking me, like, where'd you guys go? I was listening every week. We missed you. So thank
Yes,
you. Thank you for all of those that have reached out and asked what's going on. It just makes us so gratified that you're listening, that you care.
absolutely.
And we have a good one today, Shay.
We do. Today we are talking about the future of civic engagement. But before you dive in, Reza, to our new listeners, thank you. Welcome for joining us. And to our old listeners, welcome to season two. For those of you who are just here for the first time, Future Forward is a conversation Reza and I have been having for years, and it centers around the future of cities, starting from the history, historical context, present day, and then we extrapolate into the future with some strategic insights that we believe will help us to build sustainable cities and thriving communities in those cities. And so today's episode is one I know you've been really excited about, especially in light of things happening in our world today. And it is the future of civic engagement, Reza.
Yeah. I just wanted to try to do something hopeful. We talk about cities, and cities can have an impact. You can have an impact as a citizen in your cities. Citizen comes from the Latin word civitas, city. And so let's start with a definition, of, civic engagement is the ways in which citizens participate in shaping their communities, how they can influence the policies, the decisions that affect their lives. This is voting, volunteering, public advocacy, participating in community organizations. And all of this is, really has an emphasis in fostering collaboration between the residents and the government. And we spent a lot of time talking about that in our episodes in season 1. And, at a time when federal policies on climate change and immigration are shifting from, being more progressive, cities are at the front line of impactful civic change. Cities still have the resilience and power of local governments and communities within them to act independently. And this can give us hope, So we'll explore the historical evolution of civic governance, how modern cities and civic groups are successfully taking local action, and provide some strategic foresight into how cities and citizens can enhance civic engagement in our changing world.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I can imagine some of our listeners, I personally, and some of our listeners will immediately go to one of those aspects of civic engagement when the phrase comes up. I would typically immediately go to some of the public advocacy side when even the simple act of voting is a civic act. So we'll try and cover that. And I'm excited for you to dive into the history here first as we
Yeah.
begin. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is just briefly, civic engagement. The roots of it, roots of civic participation came from the ancient cities, Athenian democracy to medieval town assemblies. Most places were not countries that were like, sort of city states or feudal areas. So, but these governance structures evolved with the growth of industrial cities. We've seen this, in every episode we've talked about the Industrial Revolution really changing cities. And it created both opportunities for engagement as well as challenges with inequity and, centralization. As cities grew, diverse forms of urban governance came about. You got a council manager system, separates the policy making and administrative functions. You have a mayor council system, which is a more hierarchical model. I'll touch on this a little bit in the next section, but they were ways to find how cities could govern themselves. And the other point that I wanted to bring up here is that federal dynamics has always impacted cities. This is not a new situation that we're in. There were key moments when cities had to adapt due to shifting federal policies, such as civil rights legislation, urban renewal programs, as well as climate mandates. And this is something that we have seen and talked about a lot of, the adaptive nature of cities, because they're great systems, have allowed them to thrive even in the midst of these changes. And that should give us hope for what we can do in our current political climate that we're in.
Yeah, no, it's a good one. As we always do, you touching on the historical context made me, the thought that came to mind for me as I was listening and looking through the show notes beforehand was that what differentiates the point in sort of the word you used there was or the phrase Athenian democracy, is that before we started to have democratic institutions in cities, it was more these either class-based systems or feudal lords or entities who were in charge but took no input from the people who were residents or dwelling in the cities or the towns that these feudal lords or aristocrats were ruling over. There was no exchange or engagement. The critical word there is engagement. But with the selection of our own leaders, the act of voting for specific people to lead brought about that engagement, and it's I'd suggest a little bit more civilized way of engaging in communities, different from when you had things like even if we want to touch on some of the most heinous ones, slavery. There was no engagement between the lords and the slaves, so it shouldn't be taken for granted that we do have the opportunity to engage civically in our cities today.
Yeah. That's a really good point. I'm glad you brought it up that way, Shay. So that leads us to this next section where we talk about the current state of civic engagement. And we're going to touch on two topics. One is to spend a little time talking about the forms of governance. I'm just going to talk about two forms of governance. And then we're going to talk about like how cities and civic groups have actually found ways of engaging and enabling change. So let's start with the forms of city governance, because I think that's important to understand their impact on civic engagement and what you can do. So, this might, be a little bit of detail, but it's important for you to understand as a citizen, what form does your city government take and how can you impact it? So let's touch on two of them, the mayor-council system. In this form, the mayor, who serves as a chief executive, and the city council that serves as a legislative body. It can either be a strong mayor where the mayor has substantial executive powers, or a weak mayor where the mayor's powers are more limited and often shared with the council. So we'll take an example of a city, New York City. It's a strong mayor version of the mayor council system. And, the mayor is the chief executive, and the city council, the legislative body that approves a budget and provides oversight of the mayor's actions. Now, critics argue that the mayor's office can sometimes become too powerful, leading to decisions that may not fully reflect community input. For instance, the rezoning in areas like East Harlem were controversial, with residents feeling that their concerns about gentrification and displacement were not adequately addressed. So, there's some trade-offs with that system. Then you have the council manager system, where the city council serves as a legislative body, making policies and passing laws, while a professional trained city manager is hired by the council and runs to the day-to-day operations in the city. So the Austin City Council has this system. It has a mayor and 10 council members who are elected by the public. The council appoints a professional city manager who oversees the daily operations of the city, implements council policies, and manages city departments. And unlike cities with a strong mayor system, Austin's mayor has limited executive power. His influence is more collaborative, working alongside the council members, and then trying to influence decisions of the city manager, which can sometimes slow down decision making and make it harder to drive large initiatives. So with each, you have these trade-offs. And with each, cities face different challenges. And again, it's important to sort of understand like how your city is set up. So the second thing that I wanted to touch on here, Shay, before I hand it off to you, is I wanted to give some examples of cities exercising local agency. And this, we're going to touch on environmental policy and climate change and what cities have done themselves. So in the past few decades, federal policies on climate change in the United States has fluctuated dramatically, often reflecting priorities of different presidential administrations. The Trump administration rolled back numerous environmental regulations. The Biden administration tried to reinstate some, and we're going to go backwards again with the new Trump administration. And so cities felt compelled to fill these gaps when they showed up. So, for example, New York City, following the federal government's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement in 2017, the city committed to adhering to those goals that were set. It passed Local Law 97 as part of its Climate Mobilization Act, which set stringent limits on greenhouse gases, emissions from large buildings. And so this was a direct attempt by the city to continue climate progress and focusing on one of New York City's biggest carbon sources, its dense infrastructure. Another example is Mayor Eric Garcetti in Los Angeles launching the Green New Deal LA, which outlines goals such as achieving carbon neutrality by 2050 and transitioning to 100% renewable energy by 2045. The C40 City Network, in response to the lack of federal leadership, over 90 cities worldwide, many from the United States, joined the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. And the network enables cities to share resources, strategies for reducing emissions, and finding ways to collaborate and try to address these challenges that the world faces. But those are examples of cities taking action. Seyi, I know you have a great example of, civic groups, because that they're part of cities and how they've taken action too.
Yeah. I'll touch on that, but I wanted to. It's so interesting to go back to the point of the relationship between the mayor and the councils in some city and the structures you just shared. And a couple of the cities I've lived in, as I was looking through the show notes and as you were talking, I realized that Chicago, which is one of the cities I've lived in, is sort of a mayor council government structure where the idea there would be a weak mayor system, in the sense that the city council actually have more power than the mayor. The mayor is the chief executive, but the city council is the legislative branch of the city. And the mayor can appoint, and it's the same in London actually, the mayor can fill vacancies that exist or show up in elected positions. And the mayoral council, the council can appoint a mayor, even though we vote for our mayors, but mayoral council can also appoint a mayor depending on what the circumstances are. So that's a weak mayor system. It also it has its advantages, disadvantages, but it's super fascinating. And I hope our listeners take an opportunity to understand what system their cities implement, because that will, as you very clearly, and I'm glad you mentioned, it will impact how you can engage civically in the city. It helps you figure out where to go, who to engage with as it goes to the city. To dive into a different approach where it's more about civic engagement rather than the impact or the power a mayor can have. The example that came to mind for me, and this comes from some of the work I did before while I was working on Varuna, my business before. And we were trying to dig into where did the environmental justice movement come from? And it was, I'll share a quick story here. 1978, the transformer company was called the Ward Transformer Company, removing hazardous waste and illegally putting these toxic PCBs along 240 miles of North Carolina highways. Unfortunately, that still exists in some of these parts of North Carolina. But they were doing these illegal dumpings midnight so that no one would know what was going on. And the counties, the councils and the counties and the leaders knew it was happening, but they were ignoring it. They were doing nothing about it. And then even though it was flouting some of the Resource Conservation Acts that at the federal level, I believe, had been passed. And so a majority Black, slightly economically impoverished community in Warren County is the county. They started to organize. There was just this groundswell where community groups started to bring litigation against both the company that was dumping the illegal toxins and the EPA. So they really went all out. Hey, we're suing the council, we're suing the EPA, we're suing the company, and they were protesting for 6 weeks straight. And until finally, the council had to take action because it garnered media interest. And until the council, even as people were getting arrested, some of these agitators, the protesters were getting arrested. Over 500 of them were arrested. They didn't stop until the council had to listen to them. And eventually, it was an executive order by President Bill Clinton. Years later, it wasn't, the agitation didn't really work at that point. But when Clinton passed the environmental justice order 12898, it was referenced that it was the residents of Warren County that triggered this whole need to recognize that sometimes your elected leaders might not agitate for what you need, but if you, as its citizens and residents, agitate strongly enough, you can make the change you need to see. So found that to be the crux, the beginning of the environmental justice movement, but also such a great example of how, as much as we think we can't have impact as individuals or residents of a city, collectively we absolutely can.
Yeah. I think I love that story, Seyi, and I think the takeaway for me is that as citizens, we sometimes want gratification sooner than what actually happens. I mean, you can see in this instance, it was many, many years, after which, this was actually addressed. And so actually, speaking truth to power and trying to push for change, it might not happen right away, but, at some point it can. And so just that I find that very encouraging to hear.
Yeah.
It also sort of brings to mind an example that I had recently learned. Megan Kimball, one of the authors that we're interested in talking to, she was at the Texas Book Festival a couple weekends ago here in Austin, and she was talking about how important it is as a citizen to understand the locus of power. Like, where does the power lie for you to determine where you can enact change? And she gave the example of I-35, the interstate that goes through Austin, and how it's being expanded from 12 to 22 lanes. We're going to spend $4 billion, of course. It's going to double.
Insane.
To go from 12 to 22 lanes, just the worst climate thing that we're doing. And although the city, what she said, this was like very insightful for me, she said that the I-35 is owned by the state, or the Texas Department of Transportation, and so they can make that decision. So even though the city of Austin didn't want that change, they didn't have the ability to push back on it. And so so in that situation, like as a citizen, you need to go to your state legislators to push back on those things. Of course, now the state of Texas believes in roads and not in any other forms of transportation. So that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
But understanding those type of nuances is really important to know where can we actually affect change.
Yeah, it's man, that's such a fascinating and good example. Ties to both. I actually believe that the impact of the agitation locally to prevent the I-5 project will cause some reconsidering down the line. I don't know why. I just have,
Yeah, I hope.
again, back to the desire we have to maintain an optimistic perspective on things. It just doesn't work. We've seen this time and time again. It's almost like leaders do not recognize it's an engineering idea, and I'll share it in the show notes. I'm blanking on it now, but increasing roads does not reduce traffic. It is literally
Yeah, it's called
never
it's called induced demand. Megan Kimball talks
induce demand. Thank you very
induced
much.
demand.
Yeah,
Research has been done on it. Yeah,
yes,
and yes, so I agree with you. In fact, the most gratifying thing at the Texas Book Festival was there were two kids. There was like a line of questioners that were asking Megan, the other author, some questions, and one kid came up. He might have been 8 years old, and he asked a question, saying, what are the best forms of public transportation? I want to be a transportation planner when I grow up. And I'm like, great. We have some young people who actually care. And then the second kid came up and asked, he might have been 6 years old. He was like, should public transportation be free? That's a very, very thoughtful question to ask. And
yeah,
so you're right. Like we have to have hope that, from the young people all the way up, for us asking for something different than just building roads
yeah,
for our cities can make a difference.
absolutely. So yeah, we could go on, but I think the law, the 21 law, the of our 21 laws, the one that most applies here, as expressed by some of those young minds that are already starting to make their opinions heard, which is fantastic. And the law we have here is that participatory governance leads to better outcomes. The thinking behind that being inclusive decision making processes that actively involve diverse community members lead to more equitable and effective urban policies. And this comes from Einstein and a few other researchers, 1969. And the idea being that this ladder of citizen participation, which highlights the importance of meaningful citizen involvement in urban planning. The I-35 is one of the most stark and obvious examples of where we have not let the people, the citizens who they do not like the traffic, but more roads wasn't the ask.
Yes.
More roads was not the ask. So, and the consequence of when we don't engage in this participatory governance approach is that top-down decision making, which does not address community needs and leads to lack of public support for some of these urban initiatives. Billions of dollars will be spent on a road the residents and citizens of Austin do not want. It's kind of
Crazy.
mind-blowing. It's crazy. And then we have other examples where it's done correctly with Porto Alegre in Brazil, where the citizens actually play a part in the budgeting in the municipalities, determining what the spending priorities are. And it leads or led, because this was in 2005, I believe, it led to improved public services and increased civic engagement by the residents of Porto Alegre. And so, as much as we have examples of the opposite, there are examples of where it does work. And at the local level, at the hyper local level, this happens a lot. The soccer fields where my kids play football, there was a vote to spend money to improve the park, and it was put on the ballot because there was a lot of agitation for it to be put on the ballot, and we
Yeah.
wanted to be taxed
Yes.
to improve the place, because it's as much a a third place, as it is some of the episodes we've talked about before.
Yes.
We belong in that community because of the facilities that are made available, and we're willing to contribute to the improvement of those facilities.
Yeah, that's a great examples of what actually engaged citizens can do. And so let's touch on, our strategic foresight. Where can civic engagement go? Like, what are pathways to enable civic engagement? And the first example is exactly what you're talking about, is we need to design more social infrastructure.
Yeah.
And we've touched on this in prior episodes. We need investments in libraries, community centers, hubs for citizen dialogue. We need parks. We need public spaces. These are all ways where citizens feel that they're a community, that they're together, that they're with others, that they can have dialogue. They can run into people that they don't see in their everyday work or neighborhood. You had talked about how your team has young boys from different cultures and they're playing together. Their parents interact with one another. It wouldn't happen if you didn't have those spaces. So I
Absolutely.
think social infrastructure is key. The other is intergenerational engagement. We need programs for both youth and the elderly to interact, and making sure that all these demographics feel invested in the city future. I mean, I was so moved by seeing those two young kids get up and ask questions, because right behind them were two senior citizens asking questions about, the difficulties of growing older and not having public transport and having to rely on roads and losing their independence because of it. And so that type of engagement is critical in hearing all the voices.
Yeah.
To participate. You did talk about the ladder of citizen participation. So that's a way to address disenfranchisement. That's really important. And then for us to really adapt to these climate and demographic shifts, this is something we're going to explore in a future episode, but we're going to talk about like circular urban design, green infrastructure, emphasizing civic participation, shaping these transformations. I think those are sort of little broader shifts, and I'd like to spend a whole episode talking about that.
Absolutely.
Because that's going to be really fascinating. And then the last point that I want to make is it's really important for us to have local food systems, energy resilience with sort of more decentralized energy production, public health. All of these things foster a deeper place-based engagement to where citizens feel that they belong there, that they care about the things, not, there isn't sort of centralized stuff. There's things that are, matter to their community, and they want to engage and participate.
Yes, we will have to do episodes on almost every single one of the points you've made. And it just goes back to what we always emphasize, that as much as we want our cities to thrive, we have to do the things that foster belonging for the residents of the city. Because the more they feel engaged, the more citizens, residents feel like they belong, the better the city will be. The thing, I was exchanging messages with a friend asking about, hey, how will 2025 be? And I was like, hey, interestingly, the impact on my life that the people in my community have on me far outstrips the leaders of the city have on me, honestly. And so as much as we can create a deeper sense of belonging in the communities, and then as a collective we agitate for the things that benefit our communities, I think we'll be much better off, regardless of who the leaders are, and we feel empowered to engage civically.
Yeah. So, in conclusion, I have an ask for listeners for our mailbag. I want to hear from y'all examples of impactful civic initiatives in your cities. If you have a city leader or community organizer that we can talk to and discuss these real world civic engagement projects, please share who you think we could interview and learn from. We want to showcase some of the good things that we're doing in cities. And then, as we always do, we have a call to action. we want to encourage listeners to participate in your local initiatives, advocate for equitable urban policies, get involved in shaping their communities. I know that one thing that I'm going to be involved in is, the Mopac Highway that's goes through the west part of Austin. They're thinking of expanding it, with this double-decker express highway thing, which just sounds absolutely crazy, right over Zilker Park and
Same.
the Barton, the Barton
Yeah.
Creek and Barton Springs watersheds. Just, terrible idea over the Edwards Aquifer, just terrible ideas. And so that's like my call to action, is get involved in that and make my voice heard in it. And I encourage each one of you to do so as well.
No, that's a really good call to action. If anyone is listening to us who has listened before, you won't be surprised when we say you will find something that matters to you that you can get involved in your city. There's so many facets of our existence in cities that all you need to do is just pay a little bit of attention and you will find one cause
Yes.
that you will feel strongly enough to participate in. So, Reza, thanks for that call to action.
Yeah. With that, Jay, as we always do, we ask, take a minute to rate and review. That actually helps get our podcast more seen and recognized by others, and they start listening to it. Like and subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube. Helps the algorithm get us more widely shared. And then, and as we always ask, take a minute to send this to someone that you care about, that would be interested in. We keep increasing the number of listeners, and we hope more and more of you join us in our Future Forward community. I'm so excited about season 2, Shay.
Me too. It's just looking at the list of topics and conversations that we're lining up. It is going to be a fantastic episode. We've learned a lot of lessons from season 1 that we will bring into season 2, and we hope our listeners enjoy it as they go along for the ride with us.
Yeah. All right, Shay. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.